The anticipation before Donald Trump's speech. The murmur in the hall was a constant hum, like a bustling beehive. Hundreds of people sat in orderly rows, some staring intently at the stage, others checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors. The air was thick with anticipation and tension. Donald Trump, standing behind the podium, glanced at the gold watch wrapped around his wrist. The event was proceeding as planned. Prearranged questions, calculated answers, the usual political game he knew by heart. Yet, something in his mind felt unsettled, as if a detail was out of place. "Next question," announced the moderator, a well-groomed man in a dark suit and a blue tie. "This one comes from a young guest of ours." Trump looked up. A little girl, small and delicate against the grandeur of the room, timidly approached the microphone. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her long brown hair neatly braided into 2 plaits. Her eyes, enormous and glistening with curiosity, locked onto him with disarming intensity. Silence fell. The girl cleared her throat and, in a clear, innocent voice, asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Trump, do you believe in God?" A chill swept through the room. The previously distracted audience was now entirely focused on the moment. Journalists lowered their pens. Some audience members exchanged intrigued glances. The question was direct, no frills, so simple, yet so powerful. Trump tilted his head slightly, as if buying time to think. Throughout his career, he had faced tougher, trickier questions, yet this one, coming from a child, struck him in an unexpected way. Prepackaged answers flashed through his mind. Faith is important. The United States is a nation founded on Christian values. I believe in the power of prayer. All statements that were acceptable, politically correct, perfect for appeasing both believers and skeptics. And yet, at that moment, they all felt hollow. Trump cleared his throat. "Well," he began, offering a diplomatic smile. "That's an interesting question." Emily tilted her head. "Yes, but what's the answer?" A murmur rippled through the room. Someone chuckled. Others leaned in closer. The president felt his heartbeat quicken. For a moment, he was transported back in time, to his childhood, sitting beside his father in a small Presbyterian church. The pews were hard, the air thick with the scent of wood and wax. The pastor's voice was deep, but he wasn't listening. He was distracted, watching the light stream through the stained glass windows. His father had always told him that faith was important, but that, in the end, what truly mattered were actions, hard work, success. Faith was just a means, a moral code useful to those who knew how to wield it. Emily pulled him back to the present with another, even more pointed question. "Do you pray, Mr. Trump?" He blinked. He could feel the weight of the audience's attention. Part of him wanted to brush it off with a quick answer, a smile, and move on. But another part, deeper inside, realized this was not just some casual question. "I think faith is a journey," he finally said, choosing his words carefully, "and it's something very personal." Emily didn't look entirely convinced. But if someone has so much power, shouldn't they know for sure who's guiding them? Another silence. Someone in the audience nodded, others whispered among themselves. The question hit home. Trump took a deep breath. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, he felt vulnerable. Not because of the crowd, not because of the cameras, but because this child was asking him something he himself had avoided for years. He didn't answer right away. Emily gazed at him, unafraid, without judgment. It was just curiosity, pure, sincere. A curiosity that wasn't trying to corner him, but simply wanted the truth. "Who taught you to pray?" Trump asked, shifting the focus for a moment. Emily gave a small smile. "My grandma. She told me that when you don't know what to do, you can always say a prayer." A simple answer. An answer that struck him right in the chest. The audience was spellbound. Trump looked at the audience, then at Emily. He knew that whatever he said in that moment would be analyzed, judged, and discussed for days. But for the first time in a long time, politics, the game of perfect answers, no longer seemed important. He smiled, but this time, it was different, more genuine. "And what do you usually pray for?" he finally asked. Emily thought for a moment. "We pray that people have the wisdom to make the right choices, and that those in power use it for good." Trump lowered his gaze for a second. He hadn't expected that answer. Time seemed to stand still. The audience held its breath, every moment suspended within the walls of the hall. Trump looked down briefly, then back up, locking eyes with Emily with an intensity he rarely showed in public. "Who guides you, Mr. Trump?" the girl repeated, her voice clear yet filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. For his entire life, Trump had built an image of confidence, strength, and unshakable power. Yet, in that instant, a simple question had managed to crack that armor. The audience waited, cameras zoomed in, and journalists stood ready to turn his answer into a front-page headline. The president took a deep breath. "You know, Emily," he said, his voice calmer, "when you're a leader, you often have to make tough decisions. Sometimes you feel alone. But maybe if you listen carefully enough, you'll always find someone or something guiding you." Do you agree with Trump's answer? Write it in the comments. The little girl nodded, as if she perfectly understood his words. The moderator took a step forward, ready to steer the event back to safer ground. But Trump raised a hand, signaling he wasn't done yet. "Emily, do you pray every night?" he asked, with genuine curiosity. The girl smiled. "Yes, always. And I also pray for people who have to make important decisions." A murmur spread through the room. The simplicity of her answer struck everyone. Trump slowly nodded. "Then maybe I should start doing it more often too." For a moment, the audience remained silent. Then, applause began to ripple through the hall, tentative at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't the usual political roar, but something more genuine, more heartfelt. Something had shifted in that room, and perhaps inside Trump himself. And if you were in Trump's place, how would you have responded? We're waiting for your answer in the comments. After the event, the president returned to his office, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. He sat at his desk, his gaze lost in the documents before him. Emily's words still echoed in his mind. Who truly guided him? He had always believed that strength came from certainty, from action, from control. But now he understood that true leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was also about listening, about being willing to question oneself. He opened a notebook and wrote down a sentence he had never thought to write before. A leader is not someone who knows everything, but someone who is willing to learn. The sun had fully set behind the windows of the Oval Office, casting an amber glow across the walls. Trump sat at his desk, drumming his fingers on the polished wood. The notebook lay open in front of him, displaying the words he had just written. A leader is not someone who knows everything, but someone who is willing to learn. Emily's words still lingered in his mind. He had never been a man to dwell on existential questions. His instinct had always been to act, to move forward without hesitation. But that little girl had triggered something different within him. Not doubt, but reflection. A discreet knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His personal advisor entered with a measured step. "Mr. President, there's someone who wishes to see you." Trump frowned. "Who is it?" "Emily, the girl from the conference." A hint of surprise crossed the president's face. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon. He gestured for her to come in. Emily stepped through the door with a steady stride, clutching the small book in her hands. That same unwavering, curious gaze lit up her face. "I didn't think I'd see you again so soon," Trump said, offering a small smile. "Me neither," Emily replied. "But I wanted to tell you something." She placed the book on his desk. It belonged to my grandmother. She always said that when she didn't know what to do, she would open a random page and find advice. The president's moment of reflection. Trump picked up the book with a certain reverence. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with time. He opened it, and his eyes fell on a sentence, underlined in pencil. Wisdom is not in knowing all the answers, but in seeking them with a sincere heart. He looked up at Emily, who smiled. Maybe, sometimes, we don't need to be perfect. We just need to be real. The president remained silent for a moment. For years, he had built an image of himself as invulnerable, unshakable. But in that moment, he realized that true greatness lay in the humility of acknowledging one's own limitations. He took a deep breath and closed the book. Thank you, Emily. The little girl stood up from the chair. You're welcome, Mr. President. As the door closed behind her, Trump sat in silence for a few minutes, staring into space. Then he picked up the notebook and wrote another sentence. Maybe I don't have all the answers, but I can start asking the right questions. In the days that followed, Trump couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. Emily wasn't just a curious child. She had brought to light something he had ignored for years. The weight of responsibility, not just toward a nation, but toward himself. His advisors noticed a change. Trump, who had always been decisive and quick to respond, started taking an extra second before speaking. Journalists detected a new nuance in his speeches, not just strength and determination, but a subtle reflection, a pause before each statement, as if he was weighing his words more carefully. During a White House meeting, one of his advisors observed him curiously. Mr. President, is something troubling you? Trump clasped his hands in front of him, surveying the room. Not troubled, just thinking. The response took everyone by surprise. It was the first time they had heard him speak that way. But perhaps that was the whole point. It wasn't about admitting weakness, but embracing a new approach. One evening, seated in his study, he picked up the notebook again. Emily's book was still there, next to the lamp. He flipped through it, stopping on the underlined passages. One in particular caught his attention. A great leader is not one who imposes his will, but one who inspires others to find their own path. He gazed out the window. The city lights twinkled in the night. The world kept moving, as always. But inside him, something had changed. The next morning, during a press conference, a journalist asked, Mr. President, if you could give just one piece of advice to a young person who dreams of becoming a leader, what would it be? Trump paused. Then, with a faint smile, he replied, Don't be afraid to ask yourself the right questions. The answers will come. For a moment, the audience was silent. Then, applause began to spread. Genuine, spontaneous. Perhaps he still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Call to action for YouTube subscription. If you want more epic stories, subscribe to Iconic Stories and leave a comment with your thoughts. As Trump left the stage that evening, the moment lingered in his mind. The weight of Emily's words had stirred something in him, something long buried under years of political maneuvering and calculated responses. That night, he sat in the Oval Office, the soft hum of Washington, D.C. buzzing outside the windows. He flipped through a few policy documents, but his focus kept slipping back to the little girl's question. Who guides you, Mr. Trump? He closed the folder in front of him and leaned back in his chair. It had been years since he had really thought about faith, not just as a talking point or a political tool, but as something real. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his closest advisors entered, holding a tablet. Mr. President, the press is already running with the story. Some are calling it a moment of deep introspection. Others, well, you can imagine. Trump smirked. Let me guess, some are saying I dodged the question. Others are calling it a sign of weakness. The advisor hesitated before nodding. Exactly. But interestingly enough, a lot of people are reacting positively. Some say they saw a side of you they've never seen before. Trump exhaled slowly. That was the part that unsettled him the most. For years, he had prided himself on being decisive, unshakable. But Emily's words had cracked something open, something he wasn't sure he wanted to confront. "Schedule a meeting with the speechwriters," he said. "I want to address this." The advisor raised an eyebrow. "How do you want to handle it?" Trump tapped his fingers on the desk. "Not as a PR stunt. I want to talk about leadership, what it really means." The next morning, as Trump addressed a room full of aides and reporters, he spoke differently than usual. He didn't just talk about policies or victories. He spoke about responsibility, the burden of leadership, the pressure to always have answers, and the reality that sometimes even the most powerful people need guidance. At one point, he glanced down at the podium. In his jacket pocket was the small book Emily had given him. He hadn't opened it yet, but he would. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone asked him about faith, he wouldn't need to search for an answer. He would already know it. That evening, Trump finally took out the small book Emily had left on his desk. He ran his fingers over the worn-out cover, feeling its history, the weight of all the hands that had flipped through its pages before him. With a deep breath, he opened it to a random page. The passage read, "A leader is not measured by the power he holds, but by the wisdom he seeks." He sat still, letting the words sink in. The weight of the presidency had always been about decisions, laws, policies, negotiations. But how often had he truly sought wisdom instead of just control? As he flipped through more pages, another quote caught his eye. "The strongest leaders are those who listen more than they speak." That was something he had rarely done. Throughout his career, strength had always been about speaking, commanding, leading from the front. But maybe, just maybe, there was a different kind of strength, one he had never fully considered. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his advisor. "Mr. President, Emily's family has reached out. They want to thank you for your words today." Trump stared at the screen. He hesitated for a moment before typing back, "Tell them I should be the one thanking her." The next day, during another event, Trump did something unusual. Instead of delivering a speech prepared by his team, he set his notes aside. He spoke candidly about the importance of questioning oneself, about how true leadership wasn't just about projecting strength, but also about understanding one's own weaknesses. The audience listened in stunned silence. This was a different Trump, one who, for the first time in a long time, was reflecting in real time. That night, as he looked out over the Washington skyline, he made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't change overnight. He was still Donald Trump after all, but he would start listening more, seeking more. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. That night, as Trump sat alone in the Oval Office, he found himself reflecting on moments long buried in his memory. He thought of his childhood, his father's stern lectures on success and power, the countless hours spent in boardrooms where vulnerability was a weakness. He had spent a lifetime crafting an image of absolute confidence, but now, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, was confidence alone enough? He opened the notebook again, flipping through pages filled with scribbles from meetings and strategic plans. He paused at a blank page, staring at it for a moment before writing. Leadership is not about always having the answer. It is about knowing when to listen. The words felt foreign yet strangely liberating. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was his chief of staff. "Mr. President, there's something you should see." Trump furrowed his brow as he took the tablet handed to him. A video clip was playing, a recording from the event earlier that day. The footage wasn't just of his speech. It was of Emily, standing confidently, her eyes bright with sincerity. The clip had gone viral, capturing the public's attention in a way no campaign message ever could. Trump watched as comments flooded in from people all over the world. Some were cynical, others supportive, but one stood out. "We need more leaders who think before they speak. Maybe this is a start." For a long moment he stared at the screen. Had Emily unknowingly set something into motion? The following morning, his advisors entered the office expecting to discuss policy updates. But instead, Trump steered the conversation elsewhere. "I want to talk about leadership," he said. "Real leadership." His advisors exchanged glances, uncertain. Trump was known for being direct, for pushing forward without hesitation. This introspective side of him was unexpected. "People don't just want strong leaders," he continued. "They want leaders who understand them, who listen." The room was silent. It was a shift in tone, one that just days ago would have seemed impossible. Later that evening, Trump did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the phone and dialed a number from his past. "Pastor Williams," he said when the line connected. "I think I need to talk." The voice on the other end hesitated before responding warmly. "Then let's talk, Mr. President." The conversation lasted longer than he expected. It wasn't about politics or strategy. It was about purpose, about faith, about the weight of responsibility. As he hung up, he felt a strange sense of calm. For years, he had relied on instinct, on unwavering self-belief. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to open himself up to something more. And in the days that followed, as the world reacted to his moment with Emily, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the most unexpected questions lead to the most important answers.